Yes, please, please, come on stage, come on stage. Dr. Ahmed, yes. There's someone sitting in the audience coming. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. We're going to have a conversation, 20 minutes, with time for questions as well, with two people that are doing super important work. Please take a seat. I'm going to introduce them first, and it'll take a bit longer to introduce them because it's directly relevant for the topic that we want to discuss, which is the geopolitics of AI, which is a pretty big topic, and we can only touch part of it. Over there, we have Dame Wendy Hall, right now Regius Professor of Computer Science, Director of the Web Science Institute, but she worked on microcosm, and that's something, she was working on the idea of linked databases before the World Wide Web was there. And later on, with Tim Berners-Lee, she actually developed the Web Science Research Institute and moved on to the Ada Lovelace Institute, but she's been looking at what's happening in this technology, the internet, that's been with us for 30 years now, all this time, and saw it happening before it started. And next to me is Dr. Ahmed Elmagarmid, who's now the Acting Vice President of Research and Executive Director of the Qatar Computing Research Institute. He was here on stage this morning as well, launching the new LLM. And he's been working for many, many years as a chief scientist at HP. And that's not HP, the printers that never work, that's HP, the company that did so much innovation at the time. And you were a specialist in parallel databases, everything happening, but what is actually happening with data in the world and how can we make it work for us? Now, for both of you, looking back on this long arc of innovation that we've experienced and that now suddenly, click, something new is there, right? You both see this happening with the LLMs and the AI developments. Of course, it's not that new. It has been growing for a long time. Dame Wendy, wanted to start with you. You've been looking at the world of internet development, and especially what we want out of it. And we is societies, governments, all of us, basically. And you've described in one of your books different models of dealing with this wave of innovation coming through the internet, different from China and Europe and otherwise. Can you describe these different models? What are the different models dealing with all of this?
Thank you, Monique, and thanks for inviting me here. The acoustics are dreadful, and I have to concentrate so hard on hearing
That's what I told you about yesterday.
You did, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think you asked me about
the models for
the internet. And the reason why I've written a book about the geopolitics of the internet. I recommend it to you all. But the reason I will talk about it, but the reason it's important for AI is because it is no coincidence that it is the internet companies that are driving the development of AI. FNR is a bit of an exception in that, because the internet companies have they have the compute power, they have the data, they have the engineering skills to trawl the internet every day, and they have deep pockets. So, and that's come out of, I was very much part of the early days of the World Wide Web with Tim Berners-Lee and others, and that, of course, that was like the ChatGPT for the internet, if you think about it. Do you remember first using a web browser? And how, when there were some websites and how exciting that was? Well, that was the ChatGPT moment for the internet. And none of us really knew. We knew this was going to be about global communication. We knew people would develop ways of doing that. We didn't, I certainly didn't, and I don't think many people did, foresee what was going to happen with social media. We knew people would use it to communicate. What we didn't know is how the companies would drive it in terms of they had to have a commercial success, and we didn't know how society would use it, because our argument was that, and still is, that you've got the technology and you've got society, and these two completely different entities come together to create things that wouldn't have existed before. And in the book, we argue that there are different ways, that the internet has evolved in 4 different ways. There's still the open internet, which we all jumped on in COVID, and it didn't break. And that's a huge testament to the pioneers who designed the open internet in the 70s, 50 years ago. That it hasn't broken, it has stayed open, both in terms of the technology has supported it, but also no government yet has succeeded in changing those open protocols, no big country. And then there are 3 other ways we talk about in the book that it's evolved. One, in America, that's, as far as the West is concerned, that's where the big companies are.
Yeah.
Nobody else in the West has the big internet companies, not even Europe, not the Middle East. We have companies that have been driven by those innovations, but we don't have the companies. So that's a commercial market, and they lobby the government in Washington to get the rules and regs that help them make money. In Europe, and it's been very civil liberty driven. It's about privacy, and it's about protecting human rights. And the EU brought in GDPR. Now they're going to the AI Act, their AI Act. And then as you roll around the world, in terms of big drivers, you get to China. And China has used the internet very successfully to help the company grow, to help China actually talk to the rest of the world. But also, they have always been very careful about how they control the content on the internet, much more so than we do in the West. And those are the 4 internets we talk about in the book. And actually, every country has elements of all those. They aren't discrete. Those are just the models. And we're now writing the book about how that plays out in terms of AI. But
yeah, but
I'll leave that there for now.
For AI? Now, and this is where I would like to ask a little bit more, Dr. Elmagarmid, about what you've launched today, because that's also response. I mean, as Wendy mentioned, the big companies that are developing large language models and other kinds of models for AI, not all of them, but quite a few of them are based in the US. And they grab all this data from all of us and put it into models, but that all of us is not really all of us, right? I mean, there's 500 million people speaking Arabic, for instance, in the world, and that information is not necessarily coming into those models. Can you tell us a little bit more about Fanar? How does that model work? What did you do to make it happen?
So, Fanar is it was a really simple case. We are not trying to develop a ChatGPT-like. This is not going to be an overly sized, contains everything, an umbrella for everyone. This is not going to be Google search.
No.
This is going to be a specialized LLM that fits a niche that we believe is needed. I think that computer users, internet users in the Middle East have felt for many years that perhaps the internet has left them out a little bit. And, but this is true also, for example, for content on social media. There isn't a social media that's developed in the Arab world for the Arab world.
Yeah.
And content is dictated, and acceptable content is dictated by those that run that, that particular engine. So, so this is one thing. And I think Wendy mentioned the difference between the philosophy in Europe versus in the United States. So in the US, really the power exists with the major companies. So even though when we talk about AI strategy in the US, it's owned by NIST, by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. When we talk about safety, AI safety, it's owned, the responsibility lies with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. However, I mean, people look at it as guideline. People look at it as
They don't
sort
care.
of,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. I mean, we read all of those reports the minute they come out and look for sort of guidance. But really, the work is done in the industry.
Yeah.
It's the big players. So you mentioned OpenAI, you mentioned Google, you mentioned Gemini or Claude. So there are 3 or 4 models that, that they basically are the ones that establish the rules. And this is the way the system is set up. So when we look at what goes on in large language models, prevalent large language models, we see that there is a niche that's left out. And this is where Fanar comes. So Fanar was to address the Arab population. It's supposed to fill in the Arab language speakers. Of course, ChatGPT, as an example, it's getting much better every day. And
Also in all the languages. It's not
with
purely
languages.
a language
For sure.
Yeah.
It's getting better every day. And in fact, a lot of the answers are getting more and more acceptable there. But still, they represent a different point of view. Basically, just to close on what you said, and what I was saying this morning is the system develops the value system of the data that is used to train it. This is the bottom line. So, for example, and I just use this example very, liberally. If you use data from Al Jazeera, for example, to train your model, you're going to get a different point of view from if you use, say, Fox News to train your model.
I can imagine.
It
yes.
is.
Yeah.
Even though, Fathi is laughing, but even though you translate the data, so the language is not the problem itself, but it's the point of view, it's the culture, So those types of things, and there are many things. So Fanar...
And it's not just Arab world, English language speaking world. I'm Dutch, so I'm European. There's a regulation in Europe that it's not allowed to grab, I mean it happens anyway, but not allowed to grab all the personal data and import them into language models. The European Commission tries to prevent that. And I think, some of the language models, whether you generate pictures or text, they feel so American that I would like to say, it's obligatory to put in a lot of European data because it's different and it's not the same. So you've done this here. Wendy just mentioned that, training an LLM takes a lot of money, right? It's not easy and it takes a lot of money. The internet companies have that money. But from this region, we actually have governments initiating LLMs, right? This is not the first one. There's the Falcon model, which is an open source model. And I would like to mention it because it was the development was led by a woman, Dr. Ebtesam Amasouai. She's now the chairperson of the UN AI for Good Impact Initiative. There's also JICE, is another one, which is also an open source model. So in this region, there's an option to say, okay, let's put some funds together, let's develop this. And then, what is the purpose of having this out there?
Well, so you also brought up another thing, which we discussed yesterday when we met. There is equity. So who is able to build these large language models? Who is able to train these large language models? We're talking about an excessive, an obscene amount of money that it would take to train and to run these models. Eventually, what small company, small or mid-enterprise company, is going to be able to run serious applications in artificial intelligence? Not many. It's going to be the large companies, the large governments. So I would say it's just a fact, And within the Arab world, I think almost all AI activities are centered here in the Gulf area, right?
Yeah.
So
And
some
it's not,
activities
I mean, that's
in,
also a
in
little
a few
bit,
countries
yeah.
because of the resources that it would take. So one thing that we discuss internally is equity and accessibility. So artificial intelligence is going to increase the gap instead of I mean, remember when we first were talking about Gen AI, this is supposed to democratize information. I'm having a hard time seeing how, with the costs,
well, originally, the internet was supposed to democratize information. That was the original aim of the internet, right?
Yes, yes.
And all these things are live experiments in the world. This is what I find quite exciting, but also quite scary, because ours is the only industry, the tech industry, where you can release products without anyone saying you can't do that. Now, if you're in other industries which have to worry about safety, like aircraft and pharmaceutical, and you have to go through a lot of checks and balances before you can release stuff into the world. In our world, things are released, it's a living experiment.
And there's this interesting metric of, they do this questionnaire among, the early AI developers, professors, etc., about will AI destroy humanity? And there's a serious percentage of people that think this option exists, it's really dangerous, like Sam Altman did in the opening session.
Sam Altman told them it was,
yeah.
and he shouted very loudly.
He's not hiding it.
I do wonder, when history looks back at this era, who will be the heroes and who will be the villains in this era? It's very interesting, because we are doing live experiments. I think what they're doing here with, I'm going to say it now, what they're doing here with Fanar is absolutely fantastic. And it's a fantastic technical achievement.
Thank you.
Right? I've watched it. I've been on the board and watched it grow. Also, you're pushing back against the big companies, because that's all American or it's all Chinese, and you're saying, now we need to do this for the Arab world. And the third thing is, which is a bit of an experiment in a way, but you are encapsulating in your model the laws and standards and values of Islam, I don't know if I get the words right, the Islamic culture.
Right.
Now, this is going to happen more and more, and I find this fascinating as we go forward. Because you taught me this, if we ask Fanar a question, what's the example you use? What's the example you use? But if we use Fanar a question, or if we use GPT a question, what's the example?
Where does it differ? What is really different in the underlying model?
We run these sort of side-by-side experiments all the time. And
but if you ask something that is, there's an answer that's specific for Islamic culture.
So
I know.
Many times. I wasn't going to talk about this publicly, but...
Oh, okay. Well, I can do it. I can. Right? If you ask Fanar about...
But that's true. That's true. So the example now that the cat is out of the bag, so we run a lot of these questions. So if you ask ChatGPT, for example, about something that is unacceptable in our culture, it gives you a logical explanation. And it justifies it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's just because of some value system. But if you ask Fanar that same question, it would say, absolutely, this is not acceptable in our Islamic tradition, and so on. And this also goes, by the way, for asking about sensitive points. Say, for example, if you asked a question about the Palestinian cause. And I'm not saying that ChatGPT will give you the wrong answer. ChatGPT gives you a right answer, but it's a limited right answer. Whereas Fanar will go into detail and will tell you that the Palestinians have these rights and those rights and those rights and so on. And it goes, deeper, it will go further back, it will go further ahead. The case doesn't end in 48 and so on and so forth. So, and this is a result of the data that you use to train the model. It's not not a magic wand.
Absolutely.
No, it's not like you tell it to
Yeah.
do something. It just
And for
responds to the
Islamic
data.
for Islamic content, we go extra checking things. So, for example, once we detected it's a question about religion, about Islamic fatwa or jurisprudence or anything like that, we treat it differently. We take it to a different part of Fanar, and we once we generate the answer, then we see if there are any hadith or ayah in that answer, and then we take that out and we check that, make sure that it's correct, right? Because, I mean,
Okay.
it's unacceptable to give a wrong verse or something like this.
But,
So,
yeah.
and a system, a generic system, doesn't know these sensitivities, but we do, and we check the content again, and so on and so forth. And this is what I was saying this morning. Language, the fact that you build a model that is capable of Arabic language isn't the important thing.
Yeah.
Language is more than characters and words. Language is a culture. Language is a value system. You know, and the Arabic language is very, very rich. You know, so so this is the motivation.
I think everybody in this room will agree that it's fantastic that we have different models representing different cultures and different value systems.
Yes.
Even though, having started my life basically with the internet, the promise of it being completely open to, available to everybody in the same manner. Well,
But
China
you see,
got closed off.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, this, if we now look forward and think like, okay, there will be models, and these models will guide us throughout our day, will be our beacon for knowledge and for answers, for entertainment, etc. Those will be separate worlds then again, right?
What was your question? I couldn't hear.
That developing these models, which I think we all support, will also create separate worlds again. In this
But I think we can find a way for them to, for all these different models with different cultures. I think it's a really fantastic project you've got going here. Because the rest of the Muslim world, Islamic, I don't use the word right, will look on this and see how it's working. Can they use it? But I think our different models, just like our cultures, have to coexist. It's a really important it's a really important thing for the world going forward, so that we're not just driven by the American model or the Chinese model. A lot of Africa is driven by the Chinese model because of the way China spreads the Belt and Road through Africa. India is very interesting. They have a big Muslim population in India, at 1.4 billion people. Starting to use AI. Now, I was on the United Nations High-Level Advisory Board, and one of the things we have talked about there is how can we develop global dialogues so that we can agree overarching governance principles that take all these differences into account. So the regulation and which models are used and where they're used will happen in nation states. But how do we develop a global policy a global policy dialogue that can harmonize these into the things that promote AI for good and mitigate against potential harms. And that's where, and particularly in the global south, who are completely excluded from any of this conversation at the moment. So
and don't have the money to develop their own models either. Yeah.
And if I may just comment before we actually totally out of time. So one way to have these dialogues is to invite people like Wendy Hall, Dame Wendy Hall, to serve on the board of advisors for QCRI. She serves on the United Nations AI Advisory Board. She serves on the United Kingdom's AI Advisory Board, and so on and so forth. So, this is the way we bring our minds together. We learn from each other. But it does not mean that we don't build technology that is relevant to us and so on and so forth. I think this is wonderful. This is the way.
I think we should all build our own technology. I think Europe and other regions should also do this. But I think it's super interesting what's happening here. I think we're already being thrown off stage, right? Because I'll end with two remarks and get your response. One is gloomy and one is very optimistic. We are in very hard and difficult geopolitical times, we all know. And the geopolitics of AI is also reflected in developments there. I mean, I think some of you might have picked up that Anthropic, Amazon, Palantir, they're doing a deal with the American Ministry of Defense. OpenAI is working with Anduril, which is drone technology. There is absolutely an AI war looming there as well. I mean, the tools of a polarized world are influenced by the AI developments and the other way around. At the same time, there are also lots of bridges. And I just wanted to point out one bridge, because I didn't know this, but there's a really, well, you've seen it already, good cooperation between Qatar and the UK, for instance, to exchange information. And,
well, the big thing was the Emir's visit, the state visit to the UK, which I've been at the embassy this week, the British embassy, and that was, we thought it went really well, and I hope Qatar thinks it went really well. The Emir seemed to enjoy himself anyway, and was royally entertained. And that has led to, there was an announcement, there's many things that were agreed last week at that very high level between the Emir and the King, but our King. But one of the things that was announced was a scoping study for how UK and Qatar can collaborate on AI. You're involved, QCRI is involved from this end, and the Queen Mary's, it doesn't matter who's doing it, but Queen Mary University is leading it in the UK. And that will report in March, and I was at the Prime Minister's office this morning talking about ideas that will go into that study for some really serious collaboration between the UK and Qatar on AI, and I'm very excited about it.
Right. And the UK, of course, leads in AI, in AI safety. And actually, if you remember with the summit, with the safety summit, the UK was the instigator of this sequence, and now it's being copied in Singapore and Paris and so on.
Well, it'll be, I hope you're going to come to France, because it was horrible you didn't come to London. You weren't invited to London, but
unfortunately,
the next one's Paris.
Yes.
We have so many more things to discuss, but we have to wrap up this session to make place for the next speaker. So thank you both so much, and keep building. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
Thank you so much, Monique.
And I'm handing over to our host for the next session.